A patient confesses to murder. Wait, hang on, wrong deep dive.
Yeah, maybe next time.
Maybe. Today, though, think about a different kind of confession. More like a behind-the-scenes glimpse of potential trouble in high finance.
And the, well, pretty surprising legal drama that unfolded afterward.
Exactly. We're diving into a case from Hong Kong back in the early 2000s. It involves some really dramatic stock price swings, accusations of insider trading.
And this fundamental clash, really, between financial regulations and, well, basic human rights.
It's almost like a financial thriller. But the confession, if you like, is hidden in those sudden wild market moves.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how that initial sort of financial tremor, it exposed a much deeper crack in the legal system itself.
Mm-hmm.
It forced this major rethink about how the authorities investigate, how they punish financial wrongdoing while still, respecting people's rights.
Absolutely. So this deep dive, it focuses on this specific legal fight over Hong Kong's insider trading rules. We're looking at two individuals. Let's call them John Doe and Richard Roe for privacy, and the powers of this body called the Insider Dealing Tribunal.
Or just the tribunal.
Right, the tribunal.
Yeah.
And our mission today, for you, the learner, is to really get how these allegations of, well, financial naughtiness, basically, how they sparked this huge debate that went all the way to Hong Kong's top court. And it challenged the very idea of what legal proceedings are and what rights people have, especially in the world of finance.
And we're basing this exploration on a key document, a 2008 judgment from the Court of Final Appeal of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region.
Okay.
This document, it's like a detailed map. It lays out the initial market stuff that looks suspicious, what the tribunal did and found, and then all the appeals that came after. It's a pretty complex, high-stakes stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
And to get what's really at stake here, you need to picture the scene. January 2000, this company, let's call it Acme Construction. Its stock price just goes, well, ballistic.
Right.
Shoots up from like HK $0.34 to HK $2.10. Then trading gets suspended.
Whoa.
And at the same time, another company, Global Harmony Ltd., which owned a big chunk, 75% of Acme Construction, its share price also jumps significantly.
Okay, red flags everywhere.
Totally. That kind of sudden, unexplained surge, it just screams, something's up to anyone watching the markets.
Yeah.
Sets off all the alarm bells.
It really does. It's like, seeing one poker player suddenly rake in every single pot. You just know something's likely not right. An unfair advantage, probably.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the regulators step in.
Truly.
Right. So, next point. The Securities and Futures Commission will call into the Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA, just to keep it anonymous.
Got it.
They launch an investigation looking into possible insider trading in both Acme Construction and Global Harmony shares. I mean, that's their job, right? Keep the market fair.
Make sure it's not just tilted towards people with inside info. And the FCA, they have real power.
Yeah.
They required both Mr. John Doe, remember he was the chairman of both companies, and Mr. Richard Roe, who was a longtime business associate of Doe's.
Okay.
They required them to answer questions under oath as part of this formal investigation. This wasn't just a friendly chat.
No, definitely not. It was legally required. They had to answer under the rules back then, the Securities and Futures Commission Ordinance, even, and this is the tricky part, even if the answers might incriminate them.
Yeah, let's unpack that because it sounds, well, contradictory, doesn't it?
It really does. How does it work?
Okay, so this is where it gets legally quite interesting. The ordinance had this thing called an incrimination clause.
Right.
Basically, it said if you claimed before you answered a question that your answer might incriminate you,
Okay.
then that specific answer couldn't be used against you in a criminal prosecution, the kind that could lead to actual jail time.
Ah, okay. So like shield for that specific answer in criminal court.
Pretty much. Except, of course, if you lied under oath, that's perjury. You could still be prosecuted for that.
Makes sense.
But, and this is the absolute crucial bit, that same answer, the one shielded from criminal court, it could be used against you in a separate inquiry run under the Insider Dealing Ordinance.
Ah, so no shield there.
Nope. You were forced to talk, but the protection was limited. Fully admissible in an insider dealing tribunal, which, as we'll see, could still hit you with some pretty hefty penalties.
Wow. That's, yeah, a legal tightrope, like you said.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's move forward a bit. After the FCA did its investigation, the financial secretary then asked the tribunal, that insider dealing tribunal, a different body, to specifically investigate potential insider trading connected to those really fishy Acme Construction share deals back on January 31st, 2000.
And this tribunal, it also had significant power. They could legally force people to show up for hearings, answer questions, kind of like a court.
Okay.
And in this situation, both Mr. Doe and Mr. Roe got what are called salmon letters.
Salmon letters. Sounds fishy.
Hey, well, maybe. Think of them as formal notices. Basically saying, look, we think you might be implicated here, and you need to cooperate with our investigation.
Gotcha. And here's where that earlier point about using the compelled testimony comes right back into play, isn't it?
Exactly. This is where the conflict really ramps up. The tribunal decided it could admit and consider the answers Mr. Doe and Mr. Roe gave during that initial FCA investigation.
Including the answers where they'd specifically said, hey, this might incriminate me.
Yes, including those answers. And that decision became, well, the absolute core of their legal challenge later on.
I can see why. So what did the tribunal find in the end?
Well, based partly on that compelled evidence, the tribunal concluded that Mr. Doe was an insider trader, specifically regarding Mr. Roe's purchase of 568,000 Acme shares.
Okay.
They also found Doe liable for essentially procuring or tipping off another guy, let's call him Peter Woods, who then went and bought a huge amount, 3.2 million Acme shares.
Wow. Mr. Rowe.
Mr. Roe was also found to be an insider trader for his own purchase of those 568,000 Acme shares and for buying 100,000 shares in the parent company, Global Harmony Ltd.
Okay, so the tribunal found against both of them, and the consequences weren't small, were they? What could the tribunal actually do?
No, not small at all. The tribunal had the power to impose some really serious penalties, things like banning them from being a company director for up to 5 years,
Okay.
forcing them to pay back to the government any profits they made or even losses they avoided because of the insider dealing.
Right, disgorgement.
Exactly. And on top of that, potentially hitting them with a penalty, a fine of up to 3 times that profit gained or loss avoided.
3 times, that could be huge.
Absolutely huge. And as if that wasn't enough, they could also be ordered to pay the government's costs for the entire inquiry.
So yeah, definitely not just a slap on the wrist. These could ruin careers and finances.
Without a doubt. Which, starts to blur that line between what we think of as regulatory action and something that feels a lot more like criminal punishment.
Which is exactly the point their lawyers jumped on, right? This leads to the appeals and the human rights argument.
Precisely. Mr. Doe and Mr. Roe appealed the tribunal's findings. Their main argument was that their fundamental rights, protected under the Hong Kong Bill of Rights, which, importantly, mirrors international human rights standards, that those rights had been violated.
How so? What was the core argument?
They argued that because the potential penalties were so severe, particularly those massive fines, these insider trading proceedings were, in substance, equivalent to being charged with a crime.
Okay. Even if not technically labeled criminal.
Exactly. And if it's equivalent to a criminal charge, then certain rights kick in. Specifically, their right against being forced to incriminate themselves and their fundamental right to a fair trial, they argued both had been breached.
Which specific rights were they pointing to in the Bill of Rights?
They focused on 2 key articles. Article 10, which guarantees a fair and public hearing by an independent tribunal when determining civil rights or any criminal charge. And Article 11, which covers the presumption of innocence and, crucially, the right not to be forced to testify against yourself or confess guilt if you're facing a criminal charge.
Those seem like pretty fundamental rights.
They are, and they form the bedrock of their appeal.
So the case moves up to the Court of Appeal. What did they make of this argument?
Well, in quite a significant decision, the Court of Appeal actually agreed with Doe and Roe.
Really?
Yes. They ruled that these insider trading proceedings did, in fact, involve the determination of a criminal charge.
And why? What was their reasoning?
Their key reason was looking at the nature of the potential penalties, especially those big financial fines. The court saw them as being primarily punitive, designed to punish and deterrent, rather than just, say, compensating someone for a loss.
That distinction seems vital. Punitive versus compensatory.
It was crucial to their finding, and that finding had major knock-on effects.
Like what?
Well, firstly, the Court of Appeal held that the evidence obtained under compulsion back in the FCA investigation, remember, those answers where they claimed self-incrimination.
Yeah.
That evidence should not have been admitted in the tribunal proceedings.
Because the proceedings were deemed criminal in nature.
Exactly. The court basically said you can't compel testimony in one setting and then use it against the person in another setting that functions like a criminal prosecution. It undermines the right against self-incrimination.
Okay, that makes sense. Did they say anything else?
Yes, they also addressed the standard of proof. The Court of Appeals stated that because it was akin to a criminal charge, the tribunal should have applied the higher criminal standard beyond reasonable doubt.
Instead of the lower civil standard the tribunal actually used, like balance of probability.
Right, or even the high degree of probability standard the tribunal had mentioned. The Court of Appeals said, no, if it walks like a criminal charge and quacks like one, you need the criminal standard of proof.
Wow. Okay, so this Court of Appeal decision sounds like a massive shift in how these cases were viewed.
It really was a major turning point. But the story doesn't end there. The financial secretary wasn't happy with this outcome.
Not surprising.
No. So the case was appealed again, this time to the highest court in Hong Kong, the Court of Final Appeal.
The final showdown.
Pretty much. And this final appeal boiled down to some really fundamental, almost constitutional questions.
Such as?
Well, first, did the tribunal's proceedings really count as determining a criminal charge just because it had the power to impose those fines or the director disqualification orders?
Okay, the core question again.
Second, if the answer was yes, then were the rights against self-incrimination and the right to silence actually violated by how things were done?
Right, using that compelled evidence.
And third, related to all that, should the tribunal have been required to use the stricter criminal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt?
So the big questions landed squarely in the lap of the top court. What did they decide?
Okay, the Court of Final Appeal, after considering everything, ultimately agreed with the Court of Appeal on one crucial point.
Which was?
That the tribunal's power to impose those potentially massive fines did mean the proceedings involved determining a criminal charge, at least for the purposes of the Bill of Rights.
So they focused specifically on the fines.
Yes, their reasoning honed in on that. They stressed that the fine wasn't about compensation, it was punitive, meant to punish and deter, and could be really substantial. That gave it the character of a criminal penalty.
Interesting. But did they agree about the disqualification orders making it criminal too?
No, and this is an important distinction they made. They disagreed with the Court of Appeal on that specific point.
How so?
They viewed the power to disqualify someone from being a director differently. They saw that primarily as a protective measure.
Protecting investors.
Exactly. Protecting investors and the public by removing someone who's acted improperly from a position of trust, rather than primarily aiming to punish the individual in a criminal sense.
Okay, that's a subtle but important difference. What about the self-incrimination issue? Using those compelled statements.
On that front, the Court of Final Appeal also sided with Doe and Roe. They ruled quite clearly that using the answers compelled during the FCA investigation directly in the tribunal proceedings was a violation of the right against self-incrimination under Article 10 of the Bill of Rights.
And their logic.
It was pretty straightforward. If you legally force someone to answer questions, potentially against their own interest, in one investigation, you can't then turn around and use those very answers against them in another proceeding that carries significant penalties and is deemed akin to a criminal charge. It basically cancels out the right to remain silent.
Makes sense. And the standard of proof, did they confirm beyond reasonable doubt?
Yes, they did. The Court of Final Appeal affirmed that principle. In any proceeding that's determined to involve a criminal charge, the standard of proof must be beyond reasonable doubt. They noted this aligns with international human rights standards, too.
Okay, so it sounds like on the key points of the fines making it criminal-like, the self-incrimination violation, and the standard of proof, the highest court agreed with the Court of Appeal and Doe and Roe. So did they just uphold the Court of Appeal's decision to overturn the tribunal's findings completely?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But no, this is where the Court of Final Appeal took a really interesting kind of unexpected path with the remedy.
Oh, what did they do?
Instead of just saying, okay, Court of Appeal was right, tribunal findings are quashed, they did something more targeted. They declared that the specific power of the tribunal to impose fines, that bit in the law, Section 23 of the Securities Ordinance, was invalid.
Invalid. Why?
Because it was incompatible with the Hong Kong Bill of Rights, specifically because imposing those punitive fines made the proceedings criminal in nature without affording the full criminal procedure protections, like the protection against self-incrimination being used that way.
Wow. So they didn't strike down the whole tribunal process or even the whole law, just the power to impose fines. What was the thinking behind that specific remedy? It seems quite surgical.
The court explained its reasoning quite carefully. They were trying to balance two things: respecting the legislature's original intention, which was clearly to fight insider trading effectively,
Right.
while also ensuring that the process complied with fundamental human rights. They basically figured the legislature would likely prefer to lose the power to fine rather than lose the entire investigative machinery needed to tackle insider trading.
Sort of preserving the core function while removing the constitutionally offensive part?
Precisely. By removing the fine element, they removed the key factor that made the proceedings feel so much like a criminal prosecution and triggered those specific rights violations.
So practically speaking, what did this mean for Mr. Doe and Mr. Roe at the end of this long legal road?
It meant that the tribunal's original findings that they had engaged in insider trading and the orders disqualifying them from being company directors for a period,
Yeah.
those could potentially stand. The court didn't automatically overturn those findings.
The fines.
The financial penalties, the massive fines the tribunal had imposed based on profit gained, those could not be enforced. That part of the law was declared invalid. So it was a kind of legal compromise, you could say. They were found to be insider traders, potentially faced disqualification, but avoided the huge financial hit.
Fascinating outcome. Okay, the learner, let's try and pull out the key takeaways from this, well, really complex but super insightful legal journey.
Yeah, definitely. First off, I think this case really highlights that constant tension, that delicate balancing act, doesn't it? Between needing to regulate markets effectively to keep them fair
Yeah, that's that.
and needing to protect individual rights and freedoms from, potentially excessive state power. It's not always an easy balance to strike.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And second, it really drives home the point that when you're deciding if a legal process is criminal in nature, you can't just look at the label. You have to
Yeah.
look at the potential consequences, right?
Exactly. The severity and the purpose of the penalties are key. If it looks and feels like punishment, even in a regulatory setting, courts are likely going to treat it as akin to a criminal charge when it comes to protecting fundamental rights.
Yeah, that really came through. And thirdly, the right against self-incrimination. It's not just some obscure legal point, it's fundamental.
Absolutely. This case really underlined that. Using statements someone was legally forced to make against them in proceedings with serious punitive consequences, that can be a direct violation of basic human rights. The line between asking questions for regulation and gathering evidence for punishment can get blurry, and this case helped draw that line more clearly.
And maybe a final point, it just shows how legal systems aren't static, are they?
Not at all. They have to adapt. Courts are constantly interpreting these core human rights principles and figuring out how they apply in new, often complex situations like modern financial regulation. This decision is a perfect example of that ongoing evolution.
So why should you, the learner, care about this specific case from Hong Kong from years ago?
Well, because the questions it raises are universal, really. How do we as a society hold people accountable for serious financial misconduct, which we need to do without trampling on the fundamental rights that protect everyone? And as markets get more global, more interconnected, understanding these legal and ethical lines is just crucial for maintaining trust and, frankly, integrity in the whole system.
Definitely. Okay, so here's a final thought to chew on. The Court of Final Appeal found this middle way, right? Invalidating the fines, but potentially letting the insider trading findings and disqualifications stand. Was that the right call?
Yeah, was it a just outcome? Did it strike the perfect balance between deterring financial crime and protecting rights? Or did it maybe leave things a bit ambiguous about the true nature of these proceedings?
What does it tell us about how we even define criminals when we're talking about complex regulations in the 21st century? Lots to think about there.
For sure. And obviously this deep dive is only, scratched the surface.
Yeah, always does.
Would really encourage you to maybe look into current insider trading laws, perhaps in Hong Kong or other places you're interested in. How have things changed since this case? What are the ongoing debates about regulation versus rights in finance?
Yeah, absolutely. Share your thoughts. What part of the story stood out most to you?